We are so glad.
Right, good to see you too.
Yeah.
I mean, the last time we were here together, one of you had promised that they will join the other party, the other person's party. Lonzen, are you already a Green Party member?
I don't have a party, so how is he going to join my party?
He never came.
He's up here?
You know, he had promised to join us, that if we got 5% of the
But he didn't.
He didn't.
We got a 5%.
Okay, guys, gentlemen, that's not the conversation for tonight. We have a very important conversation tonight, and that is on the issues to do with Africa and its position when it comes to the global shifts in terms of the world order. And I'm sure that our gentlemen right here in studio will be able to converse about this. But remember also, this program is yours, like we always say here, and the only way to participate is simple. All you need to do is when you tweet across the digital platforms, you add the hashtag, the Summit RW. And of course, every time that you tweet and add that particular hashtag, it makes it pretty easy for me to be able to follow up and track your tweets. So always remember to add that particular hashtag. We had already posted something right here just to alert you on what changes the world order. Will Africa and Africans show up to contribute to what leads to this change in the world order? That's the conversation I want us to have tonight on this particular program. You've been sending in your thoughts on this, and I see Victoria's who says, awesome topic of discussion. Please upload it on YouTube for those who won't be able to watch it. Definitely your wish is our command, and that particular link is up right now, and we are live across the digital platforms on Rwanda Television, the YouTube channel, and on the website. Look, we also have JK Kaitengore, who said Africa has an active diaspora for over 2 to 3 generations, and all these interactions between home and the world at large will allow Africa to sit at the high table and exchange. I don't know about that. I'll be able to find out from our panelists right here on the program. So start tweeting, add the hashtag, the Summit RW, and I'll be right here to read those particular comments in the course of the program. As always, my name is Eugene and Nangwe. Let me introduce our panelists right here on the show. Of course, some of you already know them from the conversations we've had in the past lives that we've had right here on Rwanda Television. I have Dr. Frank Habineza. He's the leader of the Democratic Green Party. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. So nice to see you again.
Asante sana. It's like we agreed, eh? Like, the colors, eh?
Yeah, you know, and the shirts.
And also we have Dr. Lonzen Rugira, who is the managing editor for Pan-African Review. Thank you for making time for joining us right here on the show, Dr. Lonzen.
Dr. Habineza is very happy that I'm here.
I can see. We should just end this debate. You know, you guys are so here. You know? Right. And also it's important to inform our audience that we have our virtual panelists who will be joining us in just a short while. We have Eric Gavala, who's with the African Stream. He'll be joining us from Nairobi once the technical allows for that. And also Moki Makura, who's the Executive Director of Africa Unfiltered. Both of them have been working so hard when it comes to changing the narrative about Africa. We'll talk about the space of narrative in Africa taking its role in the new world order. Gentlemen, let's kickstart this particular conversation. We know that a lot is happening. A lot is changing. And, you know, when we talk about the world order, there's been, you know, a lot of it going on. And we've had major statements, including from President Paul Kagame, who said this change will continue with or without Africa. But let's talk about the options that Africa has when it comes to taking part in what influences this change in the world order. Let me start off with Dr. Habineza, and then I will pick it up from there with the Dr. Lonzen.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. I think, first of all, we should start with what does the world order mean? Because I think for many of our viewers, they're asking that. Because you mentioned the new world order. Yeah. But let's start with the old world order.
Yes.
Yeah. So I would say that world order is synonymous to global government. So it's this saying, or this issue of global government started with the League of Nations. I think that's 1948 after the World War II. And people gathered and said, you know what? We have seen a lot of bad things happening. We need to put our house in order and see how we can be able to fight back together as one voice. So later they formed the United Nations. And the United Nations, things started going to order, and then they had the UN Security Council, and then we have seen the G5, and then we had the Cold War where we had the bipolar, whereby the USSR and the US were the big boys, and then we had the fall of the Berlin War, whereby Russia or USSR collapsed, and then we had the Poland, that's the US, taking the big show, the big boy, and that has been going on until recently, when Russia came back again.
Yes.
We know what is happening now is Ukraine. Russia has re-emerged. Yeah. So people were talking about China. Is China becoming the second superpower? What? But looks like, well, Russia is back. So now is Russia back? So they have challenged the world order. So the new world order now we are going to see is what will be the role of the US, what will be the role of Russia, and there is Africa in there, and where is the UN in between. So with this, I think we have seen of recent in this past month, the U.S. Vice President is right now in Africa. She, Madam Kamala Harris, has been in Ghana and is getting to Tanzania, next to Zimbabwe. But last week, the Secretary of State, Blinken was in South Africa and elsewhere. So you can see, and then the Chinese also have been around, and the Russian foreign minister was also in South Africa and around in the corner. So we can see that there's some competition going on for Africa. So I think that with all that in press, the global government or the new global order that is coming up, and we need to ask ourselves, we Africans, what is our place?
Where's our place? And that's where I'll pick it up, the baton from, and toss it over to Dr. Lonzen. His history teacher must be very proud of him, right?
No. No. I'm going to give him a lesson.
So you want to give him a lesson?
Yes.
I'm a good student. I will be glad to learn.
Yeah, you know, I'm much older, so I need to take a longer historical horizon.
Right.
Okay,
yeah. And then plug in onto the space of Africa.
When you talk about the global order, when you talk about, so you can go all the way back from antiquity, before Christ. You can talk about the Roman Empire after Christ. We can talk about the Mongolian Empire. We can talk about the Carthage. We can talk about the Chinese Empire, not the one today, the ancient Chinese Empire. So we can talk about French Empire, most recently, British Empire, most before 1945. So we have quite a few centuries of changing global orders. The difference with the post-1945 global order is the extent of the reach of the empire. All those empires I've just talked to you about, from antiquity to 1945, they had a much more restrained reach because of the technological limitations, the extent of the reach, and the military ability to enforce imperial authority. So until maybe the Roman Empire. If we talk about Africa, the closest we can get in that conversation is Carthage. This is Tunisia. So Africa has had a place on the global table. And the last time this happened was when Carthage was burned down in the Roman the war between Roman Empire and Carthage. So, but we have, you can even call them civilizations to a certain extent. So we have Alexandrian civilization, which is African. We have Greek civilization, which is the birth of this Western civilization we see today. So, they always say that the American empire is the first empire with such a reach, but that has managed to do so without civilization. You understand? With just brute force. Because you cannot see a human advancement idea that has been perpetuated by the American empire, because it's born out of slavery, it's born out of, so on and so forth. So we are where we are today because of these shifts that can be traced back from antiquity to today. The question about Africa's place, the fact is that Africa today has no place in this. Africa is an object, not a subject. Decisions are made for it, and what it will become is decided without including Africa.
But how did we get there? How did we get to that point where we've just been a subject? We are seen just as, you know, those who do not have, and guided by those who feel they have what they think they can impose on African, countries. This is where I think I want us now to take this conversation towards.
If I may chip in, I think the African strength was first destroyed by the coming of the missionaries. Well, maybe Dr. Lanzani will correct me. When the missionaries came, they first taught the Africans how to be obedient more, and how their culture was bad, and how their religion was bad. So when that, as we know that the gun for the cross, after the cross, then the guns came, the colonizers. But of course there were also explorers in between there. And then when the colonizers came, after the Africans had been softened, so the colonizers used brute force now, and they destroyed all our governments that we had at the time, all our empires, all our kingdoms, and so on. And there was also slavery in between, whereby African strong people, strong men and women were sold off here. So when the colonialism came into place, they destroyed our cultures, because they had started that with the introduction of the new religion. And then, so Africans were weakened, both culturally, morally, physically. They were lured. So, and with colonization, then there came those world wars and so on. So by the time world wars ended, Africans were just subjects. We had no big role to play. We were just put into wars to fight other people's wars, which were not our wars. And our people were sold off. And then we ended up becoming subjects. And our kings, even after colonialism, you found that the new governments that came into place, they were working on the interests of the Western powers, or the former colonizers. So we had this new concept of neo-colonialism. So neo-colonialism has continued, even though we've finished the colonial era, but we have new colonial masters in the form of the World Bank, the multilateral organizations, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, who also set up some rules that we have to follow as African governments. You say you are independent, yes, we got independence, but there are some international rules you must follow. If you don't follow, then your country will collapse. So basically, with all that in place, and the current debate now is Africa has no seat on the UN Security Council. So this has been a debate whereby African governments or African states have asked, can we have at least one seat on the UN Security Council, so that we can be on the seat where all decisions are being taken. So this is an ongoing debate, but if we get that, then we can be on the table to make some decisions.
Right. I know of some of my viewers who probably are saying, enough, gentlemen, on the history. Let's talk about now, today. We've talked about the aspect of the past and how Africans were pushed into a corner and led like sheep to do things that, those who had colonized them wanted them to do. But listen, gentlemen, we're now talking about a region that is home to over 1 billion people. Abundant natural resources that are just here in this particular continent. We are also having a growing consumer market. Isn't this enough for the continent today to be able to influence what is changing the global order? Dr. Lonza.
I think first, the thing to consider is, why is the global order changing? First of all, you have countries that are emerging, and they want to exert their influence on beyond their physical location. And they are demanding that new rules get written in which they are able to exert that influence. So that is how the global order changes, by this pressure on the existing dynamics. Now, when there's a whole, we talked about region. So there's a whole area of study called geopolitics. Geopolitics is the study of these shifts and the influences. So these countries have a geostrategic view of how they want to exert themselves in certain spheres. So America has a geostrategic view of how it wants to assert itself in Europe, in the Indochina, in the Arab Peninsula, and in Africa.
Yeah.
The Chinese have a geostrategic view. That means a long-term horizon.
Yeah.
So in which they want to assert themselves and be able to influence. Countries seek influence for different reasons. Prestige, economic interests, many interests, many reasons. So the Russians want to exert themselves, exert influence beyond their borders and project it across Western Europe. And the war that is happening is exactly about that, the resistance of ability to exert Russian influence beyond its borders. And the Americans, through the the Ukrainians, putting their war to prevent that exertion. And the British and the Western Europe, because of its historical security and cultural alliance with the Americans, working together to barricade Russia within its a certain geo-strategic environment. Now, if you look at all this happening, if you look at what is happening in the Arab Peninsula, that area is shifting. You've been hearing about Iran making, reuniting with Saudi Arabia. You have followed the news, huh?
Yes.
You know, Turkey and the Syrians are reconciling.
Yes.
Huh?
Yes.
And if Turkey and Syrians reconcile, what does that mean for Russia, who is an ally of you understand?
Yes.
So, the world is changing. And in all that change that is happening, you don't see Africa. Because Africa, in as far as a geostrategic sense, Africa is impotent, incapable of exerting itself whatsoever.
How is this even practical? How is this possible with just the facts that I mentioned earlier on? Our population, our resources, our growing and emerging economies.
It's the dysfunction. It is organizationally dysfunctional. So its inability to marshal its resources, provide the kind of leadership that is able to conceive itself in a geostrategic sense.
Let's talk to a leader here. Why are you failing to provide that leadership that would pull us together to be able to, utilize what works for us as a continent, as a people, from a leadership perspective?
Now, I would say that for Africa, I think the African leaders, they know very well the problem, and have been trying to see how they can circumvent that problem by creating some strong institutions through the African Union. There's the new partnership of African development, NEPAD, which did some great work and is still in existence. But of recent, there's this AfCFTA, the African Free Trade Area, which was actually launched from here, from Kigali, which the main objective of this free trade area for Africa is to make sure that we remove the borders between African states and promote trade and investment across borders and free movement of people, of course, and goods. So people can go from here to Namibia, to Chad, without asking for visas and so on. And if, of course, this has went into force because most of African governments have ratified the treaty. So if it becomes more effective, I think it's one way of how Africa can trade as one big bloc. And if Africa is able to do that, we will have a big bargaining power with other big superpowers like the US and others, and the European Union and so on. So I think that the African leaders are not sitting just blindly. They know what is happening. They're doing something. And also within the African Union, there have been other mechanisms of enforcing the regional economic blocs, they call RECs, regional economic communities. For example, the East African community, the way you see the East African community is being set up and being reorganized is to sort like in the same mode of the European Union. And you saw the institutions in place, to have the East African Parliament, to have the East African Court of Justice, to have many things in place here. And look at the SADC and the ECOWAS. The ECOWAS is actually very strong. They even have a military body there. And I think within the EAC also we have set up a military body, military organ to which can help to fight or to support other countries. So I would say that it's not that our leaders, they are not seeing. They are seeing. They are trying to reorganize. But the biggest challenge we have, the post-colonial era, is that Africa, we have not been able to industrialize. We still, all our natural resources or raw materials, they are always sent to European countries or to the West, let's call it the West. So our gold, our minerals, our tea, our coffee, everything is sent as raw materials. We cannot process and make this, send it as a finished product that can fetch in more money.
I'll be wanting to understand how we've not been able to take advantage of the external relations that we've had over years, the diplomatic lines and the friends that Africa has had over years, to be able to convert that into, proper support in terms of systems. But let me invite our virtual panelists who are joining us. Just one minute, let me bring in Moki. Moki is joining us from London. Moki, first of all, sincere apologies for the technical hitch and partly some of the miscommunication that has taken place, but finally we're here with you. Could you be able to just talk to us a bit about, from where you sit, on this whole conversation of the changing global systems and the new world order? We have started by having a historical background of where we've come from and why these changes are taking place. But I would love to hear from you. What do you feel about what is going on when it comes to these changes that are taking place and Africa's place in this conversation?
Well, that's a big question. I think the dynamics, the power dynamics across the world are absolutely changing. And I think Africa is finding its feet and it's found its mouth in a way. Sorry, am I still on?
Yes, I can hear you, Moki. Proceed. Yes. Go
yeah.
ahead.
And I think one of the biggest things for me is the sort of the relationship between, global north, the richer countries, and, so-called poorer countries like us in Africa. And I feel that there's this dynamic that we're the beneficiary and they are the ones with all the money. But I feel that we're now understanding what is needed. So we are able to go with specific requests for what is needed. And I think that's actually key. And we've talked about the Continental Free Trade Area. There are all these initiatives that are happening. The RECs, there's a lot more of us as Africans, as countries, actually coming together to actually start, leading our own development instead of doing what the richer countries want us to do, because that actually has been the dynamic. If you look at how, like, for example, global philanthropic funds are split. They split them in terms of interest. There's huge amounts of money to work on gender issues, huge amounts of money to work on HIV or malaria, and if that is not your country's priority, you don't get that funding. Yeah. And that's been a dynamic that we're needing to change, because if you can go to those funders and say, okay, we may not be prioritizing malaria right now, we're actually prioritizing sort of job creation and economic development. And there is now funding for that because we have our voice. We're asking for what we need. And I think that's the biggest single dynamic change, that the continent has actually found its voice. We have the agency and we are trying to create the change that we need to see.
Right. Moki, you say it rightly, and some people would argue and say there's usually no free lunch. And this is what has happened over years when it comes to the issue of aid and how it's been used to influence, some of the directions that those who are giving it want in terms of, some of the policy shifts within the countries that they operate in. For example, President Paul Kagame did mention, and I'll quote what he said, the world order is influenced by those who have something in their hands. They have the tools, the power, and for them, in many cases, they are pursuing their interest based on their values that they are mostly imposed down on the continent. Let's talk a bit about even what is happening in countries whenever they pass laws that they feel that internally within their African countries, those laws work for them. We always see red flags being pulled, by certain countries. For example, just down here in Uganda, we've heard about, the recent law on the homosexuals. In Kenya also there was that. And then there's always debate about how those rules are stifling what is going on. For how long will Africans then be able to do what they feel works for them without a prefect sort of, walking with a stick around them, or a carrot for that matter?
And look, I don't want to make excuses for sort of countries in the global north and their sort of aid policies, but a lot of these are democratically elected governments who are actually accountable to the electorate, who pay the taxes. Yeah. So a lot of this grandstanding is because they have to justify the money that goes into Africa. And I've seen, blogs and articles written by MPs who've traveled to countries to prove that actually the aid is working. And it's going to a country that has good governance, that protects human rights. So I understand why they make those kind of pronouncements that we're actually going to, restrict our aid donations to you if you don't live like we do. But that's where I think that an equal balance of power lies. They feel that they can do that. And I think Uganda has turned around and said, well, you know what? I don't know. But I think countries need to put up and say, well, this is the law that we as Ugandans have passed. I'm not talking about the rightness or the wrongness of the law. I'm just talking about your own sovereignty as a state, for you to be able to create laws that your parliamentary system has passed without an outsider coming in. And if you look at a lot of these countries, they always point to China, that China invests in Africa, but it doesn't pay any attention to, the human interest, human life, and all of these things that they supposedly care about. I mean, China has a clearly different approach to Africa.
Right.
It doesn't come in and tell you anything. It gives you what it wants and it takes what it needs.
Right.
That's itself a problem
Interesting. Interesting. I want to come back to the panelists in studio, but let me bring in Eric. Eric, from where you sit, you have been working on the issues to do with changing the narrative at African Stream, same as what Moki has been doing at, Africa No Filter. Talk to us a bit about the place of narrative in how Africa is seen when it comes to its role, even in this new world order shifts that we've continued to see.
Thank you so much for having me. Well, I think it's a very important conversation we are having, and the narrative of Africa is something which it has been debated for a long time. We've come from a time where Africa was seen as this poor continent where people are just swinging on trees and we are still living in huts, where it's a shock when you show up with a mobile phone, or you show up in London or in the US, basically people asking you, how did you get here? So this is mostly because of that narrative. And narratives are important because Africa is not respected around the world because of the narrative that we've had, a terrible narrative. I like to call it, the longest propaganda campaign, and maybe even the most successful one in history, because there's this group of people called Africans that have been, brainwashed in their minds to think that they are less than, and that they will always come last, and that, they have to be subservient to other people, maybe in the West, in Europe, of course. So I think the narrative of Africa is very important. We are really working hard to make sure that Africans themselves start thinking about Africa as a different place, a place where we can compete, with the rest of the world, where we can have our intellectuals compete with the rest of the world, our industries. Now we're having the conversation of value addition on the continent. Yeah. We've seen talk about, how Nigeria is pushing Tesla to do beneficiation in the country. And Zimbabwe is still the same conversation with their lithium, another conversation in the DRC. So this is not something that is just happening in pockets. We have African countries coming together and speaking in one voice. And the AfCFTA, it's very important. However, there are still some challenges in there because this is something which was launched in 2012, if I'm not wrong. We are 10 years in, but there's still some, some challenges here and there. The most of it is working well for Africa, but there are still some issues here and there which we need to sort out, like the donor, the origin, home of origin discussion. Yeah. Whereby, African countries need to have home-based industries. Yeah. So that if an industry exists in Ghana, for example, and it can trade with Kenya, for example, these are supposed to be Ghana-based and Kenya-based industries. But if Volkswagen, for example, sets up a plant in Ghana, and they can operate and they can sell their cars to another African country because they are based in Ghana, you see, that's where the challenge is. So it's just one of the issues which, I picked up that is ongoing with the AfCFTA. Yeah. But in terms of narrative, we have to really speak positively about Africa, think positively, and bring up our kids in a way in which they understand that Africa is the place to be. We are not begging anyone in the world, for attention or for aid, for that matter.
Right.
Well, I believe the multipolarity of the world right now is something which we have seen, the shift of power sort of from the United States to China and Russia and the East. That is something which benefits Africa because we've been dictated to for a long time. And it's time for Africa basically to shine and speak for its own self. There are many examples across the continent where this has been received with celebration because we've been under that whip or that lash for a long time. So the multipolarity helps.
Multipolarity helps. Thank you very much, Eric. Stay with us, Moki, and Eric will still be able to bring you back on this particular conversation. Let me bring back Dr. Lonzen. You had wanted to react to some of the statements that Dr. Habinez had mentioned, but as you come in also, talk to us a bit about the aspects of, groupings like BRICS. We've seen Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa coming together to try and push for some influence when it comes to all this. And they're pushing for, cooperation that probably, what Eric says, is going to be beneficial for Africa. In what ways does Africa benefit from this, and are we leveraging on this?
Africa is going to continue to be exploited for as long as it is unable to conceive itself as a factor from a geostrategic sense, like I said, because there is no organizational capacity through which it can exert any kind of influence.
Organizational capacity, we have the African Union.
Please, please, let us be serious. This is why I was talking about.
Yeah.
When I talked about this absence of organizational capacity to bring meaning to any strategic ambitions for the continent, the long list that Dr. Habinez gave was the demonstration of the failure of that presence of that which we are looking for. The entire list he gave demonstrates the utter failure and dysfunction and the inability to be of meaning at a global table. We go there empty-handed because we are unable to engage the rest of the world strategically. Totally incompetent.
What would be the ideal situation?
Like I said, Africa, now, there is something that you need to understand in this shifting global geopolitics.
Yeah.
When a power is trying to exert its influence further, it is trying to ensure that it is not facing a rival in the space in which it is exerting itself.
Yeah.
So the way that they ensure that they don't meet a rival in Africa is by preventing the emergence of a meaningful Africa that is able to exert itself in a geostrategic sense. Yeah. So in that way, Africa meets a force that it cannot contend with.
Always repelling it.
The infancy in which Africa stands in its pursuit of being of any meaning geostrategically is such that it meets a force whose intention is such that no such force, no such rivalry ever emerges, so that you continue to be a source of exploitation of raw materials, which is one of the reasons why states seek to exert themselves beyond their geography. To find cheap raw materials, to find markets, to have the, So, to be powerful, all that comes with being powerful, the prestige, so on and so forth. So, all these things, the way, how one country tries to pursue it, that is why America is preventing for the unification between China and Taiwan, because it wants to divide, because it doesn't want a rival, a united rival that is going to continue to become stronger, because once you have consolidated your backyard, that means you are going to start spreading your tentacles outside.
Yeah.
So the fact that you should not consolidate your backyard is a geostrategic goal of a global superpower.
Yeah.
So the infancy of Africa, in terms of what it is, the self-conception as a meaningful actor geostrategically, its infancy means that anytime it tries to, yeah, this is now, there's so much to talk about here. But now, when you talk aid, someone talked about aid.
Yeah.
Aid is one of those tools that are used to project influence. This idea that countries that don't account for aid, don't do well aid, it will be taken away, that's a joke. Whether you effectively use aid or not, you will continue to get it, because it is important in the geostrategic calculations of the aid donor that you continue to receive it, because that's the way you are influenced. If it is taken away, they can't influence you. Yeah.
So they'll keep giving it.
Yes. In the same way, the aid recipient is prevented from thinking in a strategic manner. Yes.
You've talked about the infancy of Africa. The continent is now saying, look, nobody remains an infant forever. There's growth in terms of some levels, some stages. The continent right now is saying, let's unify, let's come together under a common market, platform. For those who have hopes that this probably will be one of those things that Africa can stand on its own and do its own terms, because if you don't want to trade with us, we'll trade with ourselves as a continent. Should they lose hope?
No. You should never lose hope, because what is the alternative? That's why people pray, Now, the idea that Africa, whether it's generation, this generation, the generation after, and after it, the idea that each generation should attempt to make steps leading it to becoming a meaningful actor in the global sense, it's worthy of pursuit.
Yeah.
But we should not confuse ourselves to the idea that it is existing, because that is also denial, and it's not helpful. Yeah. So we need to be very honest in the fact that we are geostrategically impotent, and we begin from there to look for the cure for the impotence.
For the cure for the impotence, Dr. Habineza, there's been a question on internal capacity, which Dr. Lonzen mentions here, and he points it as one of the reasons as to why we are facing what we are facing today. Let's look at the realities of that, because at the end of the day, the continent is full of resources. Yeah. Where we see some of the gaps is even in the spending of our fiscal budgets, where we direct the monies. You mentioned the issue of how industrialization would help. Yeah. But we haven't seen much of that in most of the African continent, countries within the continent. We've seen monies or budgets being allocated to areas which probably are not seen as priority areas. We have assistants of assistant ministers, advisors of presidents, who probably even the president is the one who's advising them, like other people usually say. Talk to us a bit about how this can be corrected from where you sit, from a leadership perspective.
Well, it's such a tricky question, but I would say that first, to cure problems, that you must first understand the problem that you have. So I think most of the African governments do really understand the issues at hand, the problems we have. And as I mentioned, because they do understand, they have been putting up mechanisms to counteract those issues through the creation of the African Free Trade Area, through the strengthening of regional economic communities, the East African Community, ECOWAS, and so on. And trading blocks, we have the COMESA, Commonwealth Market for Southern Africa, and so on. And so we could see that there are some efforts being put in place for African countries to strengthen themselves so that they can be one big trading bloc, one big political bloc that can negotiate with other powerful blocs. Of course, there are challenges. Challenges, we have corruption. Most of African governments or political leaders, they are very corrupt. they get that aid, which Dr. Rosena has mentioned, and they eat all the money. They're supposed to construct roads for people, but they don't construct the roads, or they eat the roads, as people say. The schools get money for schools, they don't construct the schools. The hospitals, they don't have medicine. So, I mean, we have a...
That is the failure.
That's a failure.
That's the failure of incapable of understanding the challenge in a strategic sense.
Exactly.
If this is what the leaders are doing, this is a demonstration of the failure to grasp the challenge before you.
So this is the biggest challenge, that you have this aid, but you're misusing the aid. Even you have the taxpayers' money. And we have seen even here, the government of Rwanda has been very serious on fighting corruption, and with our zero tolerance corruption policy. But still, you find that people still find ways of stealing government money, people's money, and so on. But anyway, what I would say that the internal capacity, we have to first recognize our problems, and then find solutions, and then work as a group together so that we can counteract the others. Two is that we should be able to install democracy, the good governance, let me call it good governance, within our countries, because the others will be coming in to say that you are not well governed. Yet we have the capacity to govern ourselves well, because we did do that sometimes back. I mean, before the colonialism, I think African people used to organize themselves properly, maybe much better than today. So I think we have the capacity to do that. But we should try to go back to the roots and also promote, like Rwanda has this made in Rwanda policy of trying to promote locally made whatever goods, but also industrialization, try to use that. I have seen they are doing the same in Uganda, and then maybe other countries are doing the same. I also seen in South Africa they are doing the same. I even saw a magazine recently of Made in Africa. So I would say that when we say Made in Africa, Made in Rwanda, that means we are putting money in our local industries so that we can produce and be able to sell to ourselves, but also to the others. So that way we will not be dependent, because African people, we have a problem of always wanting something from the West. If it is a shirt, you want a shirt from Europe or from America, you think it's better than the shirt made in Rwanda. So we should stop that, change the mindset. So we need mindset change.
Mindset change. Okay, if you're still...
I'll talk to you about BRICS when you are ready.
Yes,
because you had asked about
to you. Let's have Moki. Moki, from where you said, I mean, you've heard from the panelists right here. They've talked about the aspect of failure in leadership. We've talked about the fact that, the infancy level that the continent is in, it makes it difficult. Every time it wants to move to another level, there's always a blockade that stops it from moving from that perspective. Do you believe in this? I mean, look, over 1 billion population. We've talked about the resources that the continent has. What is the missing link? How is it that this continent is not able to stand and speak with one voice and be able to feed the world and move everything from one particular point to another in terms of influence?
Well, and look, again, that's another huge question. And I think that, the continent can feed the world. We know that. I feel there's a lot of things that are challenges for us. Number one, we're 54 different countries. And I feel people underestimate that, because every country has its own sovereign intention. Right? So even the AFCFTA, not every country has domesticated that law. That some of them are challenging that freedom of movement. Maybe you can move your goods across, but they don't want people coming. Right now, Rwandans can't get, well, for lots of reasons, visas for South Africa, and likewise. People can't move around. So there's still a lot of blockages. And a lot of it is to do with the fact that I think we are still a very young, democratic continent. We have people in power who are still struggling to stay in power. So their vision is the next election, not what is the long-term vision for our country. And I think that's one of the fundamental plans. There are blocks, but if we're thinking about them, because every problem is solvable if you put the right resources and the right focus behind it. But right now, I feel that a lot of our leaders are distracted by power and money. And once in a while, you get some amazing initiatives. The other gentleman talked about, lithium, Zimbabwe stopping exports of lithium, countries trying to say, no, come here and do the work. But there are not enough people thinking and implementing these things, because sometimes it's in our interests to keep the dysfunctions in Africa. And I think it actually starts with leadership. The right leadership, you can make a lot of change. And I think that's the biggest challenge.
Right. Eric, I mean, from picking just from where Moki left in terms of leadership, what would be the role then of the common citizens, the ordinary citizens who actually elect these leaders to office?
Well, just before I get to that, Eugene, I think, you know, the level of Africa bashing, sometimes, you know, we need to like rein it in, because, you know, when we talk about Africa, we have to look at Africa relative to elsewhere, you know, in the world. The issues of leadership, issues of corruption, issues of bad governance, you know, we've had, you know, all of these bad stories being told about Africa, but there are places where you know, the continent or countries are doing very well to reduce the experience of Africa or the entire continent to a single story of poverty or greed or corruption. I think is a disservice. And I think, as Moki said, you know, Africa is a relatively young continent. You know, until 1960s, most of the continent was still being colonized. So to compare, you know, our story with countries that have had 400 years head start, I think is a disservice and is not looking at the whole picture. So when we look at it from that perspective, we'll see that, you know, despite the challenges, there are places where things are going well, where we can emulate. And, you know, when you look at the corruption index, you know, it behooves me that, you know, South Africa is doing much better than Poland. Botswana is doing much better than Italy. You know, Ghana is doing much better than Greece, and Rwanda is doing much better than maybe even half of the countries in the world. But these stories are never told. Africans only see the wars and the dictators and the bad stories that are coming out of the continent. But the positive stories, the narratives of success, are stories that are, you know, pressed down upon, and we never get to see them. So I think a paradigm shift with the way we look at the continent will matter, even as you know, young people or as the normal citizens. The power is now in our hands. You know, back in the day, the power dynamic in terms of telling the African story rested just, you know, with the corporations or multinational corporations or the government. But now we have a time where, you know, everyone, maybe let me say 60% of Africans own a smartphone. Internet penetration across the continent is very high.
So we should
start telling basically, you know, ordinary Africans can't tell the African story by themselves. You just need to grab your phone, you know, just go out there, vlog, and say, you know, this is something positive that is happening here, and this is something great, we should do more of this, we should emulate this, or, you know, even the challenges we can talk about. You know, I'm not saying that we should bury our heads in the sand and just give our leaders a get out of jail free card. So we need to tell these stories ourselves, the positive ones, and I like to insist that, you know, it takes ourselves telling the African narrative in a proper way before foreigners or before other companies, you know, that are the BBCs or the CNNs and the CGTNs, that they will start to emulate how we tell the story. So I think institutionally, companies are doing it, companies like African Stream, African No Filter, but individually, individuals should also just take the power in their hands and tell the story themselves.
Of course. I'll now bring back Lonzen to talk to us about the BRICS and how it will influence the changing dynamics that we've been talking about right here as we start wrapping up the program today. I mean, do you see any shift in this? Because we are talking about Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Should other African countries jump into this? Is this the way to go?
Let me first give you hope first. You asked for hope.
Yeah, we have only 2 minutes to go.
Okay. For Africa to be able to think in a strategic sense, in terms of what we are talking about, you need a critical mass of African leaders. I think when people look at President Kagame, they say, okay, he's thinking about Africa in a strategic sense. But you need like a critical mass of African leaders who are like him. About 18 leaders out of 54. Where are you going to get 18 leaders who are thinking like Kagame about Africa?
You're here, one of them.
You get my point? You need 18 African countries thinking about Africa in a strategic sense. At one time, they have to be in power at the same time. Not after one has left, be replaced by another. No, they need to be 18 African leaders scattered across African continent, operating the way Kagame is operating.
That's the direction we need to take.
Okay. If I give you to count how many exist today, how many will you give me?
It's a hard question.
In the next 100 years, how many? When do you think we'll have a time when we have 18 or 20 who have that sense of clarity about Africa at one time? In the next 50 years, how many? When do you think it will happen?
You tell me.
Okay. I don't see it happening in the next 50 years.
Okay.
So this is the challenge of the next generation of Africans.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
About BRICS, the reason BRICS is emerging is because the preceding global order also had the IMF and World Bank as the financial institutions to exert their influence.
Yeah.
BRICS is going to do the same for the emerging global order.
So it will just be another repeat of what we've been seeing
Yes,
with that rest.
yes.
Dr. Abineza, in closing, before I read the comments.
Well, first of all, I think for Africa, we need to build strong institutions. Dr. Ronzed has talked about the leaders. I think, yes, leadership is good, to have good leaders, good presidents, and so on.
Yeah.
I think we should put more focus on strengthening our institutions so that we have institutions that work, we have institutions that can fight corruption, we have institutions that can protect us from external threats and even internal threats. So the institutions that can fight those external influence. So if we build our strong institutions as African countries, that's our internal governments, but also the African institutions, those African unions and so on. If they become strong enough, I think they can outlive our leaders. That's one.
Which comes first?
Two is that we need to have good leadership, good governance within our country so that we can be able to manage whether the small resources we have or ours or even external aid that we get.
Right.
And then finally, we need also to change our mindset, to have mindset.
You've mentioned
change.
that so much on the show.
So that we can think ahead.
You need good leaders to nurture the institutions. So we get back to
when
the
we'll get those
18 leaders across
in the next
Africa
50 years.
who are able to nurture institutions
but even,
that are able
even one
to
leader
project.
is able to change.
Let's have Eric, just one word in closing kindly. Just one word, under 30 seconds. Eric, are you there? Moki?
In closing, I'd like to say that the power of the African narrative is on our hands.
Yeah.
And we need to basically change our perspective, start looking at Africa as a place that is, on the up and up.
Right.
I think we've seen positive developments in French-speaking West Africa, where Burkina Faso and Mali have kicked out French troops, and they are basically just starting the process of finding their own voice.
That's
so we
over
have
30
places
seconds,
where things
Eric.
are moving well. Let's keep telling those stories.
Right.
Come over to African Stream, you'll see more of those.
Right. Moki, in just under 30 seconds, please.
Yeah, my quick thing, the one thing we need is we need to build an African dream. We need to have our own dream, our own aspirations, that our own young people will want to stay on the continent, invest in the continent, and actually be proud of being here.
Right.
And that starts with stories.
Perfect.
We need to tell those inspirational stories.
Thank you very much. Let me just quickly read some of the feedback that we're having. Jacques Ichura on Twitter says, unity is key to Africa's global influence. As Africans, we need to speak with one voice to amplify our impact in the world order. Unless we put aside our selfishness and prioritize effective leadership for a brighter future, we'll not have a space in this global world order. That's what he says right there. We have Dolapo Aina who says, interesting views by the guest. Africa might have lost the plot due to not having long-range strategic plans. How do we explain that? The Arab world has now gotten a seat at the high table with pan-Arabism slashed with resources, but Africa isn't at the table. These are very important conversations that we'll definitely continue having right here on this particular show. And we'll definitely be able to see you again next time, same place. I want to say thank you to our panelists who've joined us. I'm told we are running out of time. The news is coming up next, but we hope that we'll be able to have more meaningful conversations continuing on our online platforms. The hashtag to use always is #TheSummitRW. As always, my name is Eugene Andangwe. I want to say goodbye for now. Dr. Abineza, Dr. Lonzen, thank you very much for making time.
Thank you.
I think we'll have you guys here next time, okay?
Sure. We are more than
Just have a seat. Let's just catch
okay.
up a bit here. We need to have this conversation on the issue of the party and whether he is joining.
And we have elections coming
Are
up
you
soon.
running in 2024 by the way?
Oh, why not? If you people trust me to
I'm
run, why
running
not?
for the president of Green Party.
He wants to make a coup d'etat. No way.
Okay.